Hello, Sarah of SEK Handmade here, and I'm back again to talk about pattern testing. In my previous videos, we covered what is pattern testing, why would you want a pattern test, and if you decide you do, where to find some pattern tests. And then in my second video, we talked about making the best decision about when to volunteer for a pattern test, and then how to put your best foot forward to hopefully get chosen for the pattern test you desire. Today we're moving on. You've gotten chosen. You've been chosen. You've been chosen for that pattern test that you wanted. Now what? We're going to talk about some ideas of processes to go through to make your pattern test streamline and make sure that you are being the best pattern tester for the designer and that it's as stressless as possible for you as well. All right, you've been chosen for the pattern test. Yay! Now what? First, most often, designers will send you an email. Read this email carefully. There may or may not be lots of information in there about really specific things that the designer is looking for you to do throughout the test. Each designer runs their test a little differently, and so read that over very carefully first so that you have a clear idea of what the expectations are and if there's anything you need to do to get rolling. Some designers parse out the pattern so that you have to get to certain milestones before you get the next section of the pattern. So don't panic if you open it up and you're like, all this has is the information in the gauge swatch. Read carefully because hopefully the designer has explained all of that to you. But I have also absolutely been on tests where the designer is like, here's the pattern. And I've been like, oh, okay, what do I do? Especially when I was first starting. My very first test was like that. The designer was like, here's the pattern, work it, let me know. And I was like, let you know what? So we're going to talk about those things today so that if a designer doesn't give you really specific instructions, what can you do to give some really great feedback and be a valuable tester? And help maybe supplement some of the things that maybe weren't specifically asked for, but are really helpful when it comes to testing. The very first thing I do when a designer sends me a pattern to test is, I'll be honest, I print it out. I am a pen and paper person. I notice mistakes best when I'm holding a physical copy in my hands. You don't have to do that if you are a digital person and you work well reading and looking at things digitally. That's cool. Download it to your computer or your tablet or your phone or whatever and look through it on there. But the very first thing I do, whether I recommend everyone do, whether you print it or just download it, is take a look through the entire pattern first. When I'm doing this first run through, I'm looking for several things. I am looking for sentences that don't make sense. Are the directions clear? Are there grammatical things that are missing? Are we missing? I'll be honest, I was not an English major. And so like commas and stuff aren't my forte, but are we missing a period? Are we missing a capital letter? I know in my personal patterns, things like typing you instead of your, or little words like that maybe just got typed wrong. My first run through, those are the kinds of things I'm checking for. And then I read through the instructions of the actual pattern as well, and just start to form a picture in my mind of what does this look like? If I'm working a cardigan, is it worked from the top down or the bottom up? Are there panels? Is it raglan? Do we do sleeves first? Are we going to attach a ribbing at the end? Having all of those details kind of shuffled out in my mind is, to me, a good start to notice if there's anything that doesn't make sense. I take notes, and then this is a great place to stop and ask questions if you have questions. The very next thing you're going to probably need to do is make a yarn substitution. Anytime you're not using the exact same yarn that a designer used, you're making a yarn substitution. This can be a little tricky. I have a full video on making yarn substitutions. So once you're done with this, click that link in the description below and go watch that video. But just real quick and generally speaking, try your best to keep your yarn fiber content and weight as similar to the designer as possible, and then you're going to find gauge swatching to be easier. After you have made your yarn substitution, you've chosen what you're going to use to work up the pattern, you must gauge swatch. Friends, when you are working whatever pattern you've purchased for your Aunt Linda for Christmas, if you don't want to gauge swatch, don't gauge swatch. But when you are working a pattern test, you must work a gauge swatch. The designer is looking for more than just a done project. Usually they want to know fit, they want to know yardage a lot of times. And if your gauge is significantly off, you're not going to give accurate information. Gauge swatching is another complex topic. I have a whole series of videos on making great gauge swatches. Highly recommend you give that a watch if gauge swatching is something you struggle with, because knowing best practices for that can make this first step of the pattern testing process a lot less painful. So again, check the description below to links to all of my gauge swatching videos so that you can check those out and notice all the important things about gauge swatching before you get started. Just quick suggestions. When you are starting your swatch, start with the yarn you've chosen and the hook noted in the pattern, and then go from there. Note if your gauge is worked flat or in the round, because your gauge swatch needs to match flat or in the round. If it doesn't say, usually you should do however the pattern is worked. So if you're working a hat and it's worked in the round, work it in the round. If you're working a sweater and it's in turned rows, you can work a flat swatch. If you're working a scarf and it's flat, you can work it flat. Pay attention to if your swatch needs to be blocked. This is important too. Depending especially on your fiber content, blocking can change the gauge of your swatch significantly. And if you don't block, you could work a whole project completely wrong. So pay close attention to that as well. My last recommendation for blocking or for gauge swatching, pardon me, other than my lots and lots of tips I have in the videos in the description, are you got to make your gauge swatch bigger than the stitches and rows indicated in the gauge. You always want to measure in the center of your swatch. Those stitches are most indicative of the stitches you'll make across the whole project. So make a bigger gauge swatch and you will be more likely to be spot on with your final project as well. If you work your gauge swatch and you have too many stitches, you need to go up a hook or needle size. If you have too few stitches, you need to go down a hook or needle size. If you can't meet gauge, have a discussion with the designer. If this is a designer that's chit-chatting back and forth with you, ask them what they want you to do. Would they rather you meet stitches or would they rather you meet row height? How important is it to be spot on? Are they okay with some modifications to the pattern? So like if you're meeting stitches, but your row height isn't quite enough and you're going to need maybe extra rows, or if you're a short person like me, you might need a few fewer rows. Ask the designer about their preferences for that. If you don't meet gauge exactly, that can often still be okay. But again, important to have a discussion with the designer about their preferences for what you should do if you can't meet gauge. One of the things designers are often looking for is how much yarn do you use? It is really important to me as a designer to give as accurate as possible estimates of how much yarn someone will need when they're working the pattern. I try really hard to give a little buffer. So if your gauge is off a little bit, hopefully you won't run out of yarn. But I also try not to be in excess, because it's also kind of annoying when you get to the end of a project and you have like 3 extra skeins left that you didn't need, especially if you can't return those. So a designer will often want to know how much yarn you used. You can kind of estimate this, but if you are going to be a regular pattern tester, I highly recommend you get a small scale. Kitchen scales and postal scales work really well for this. You can find a ton of them online. I will link a couple down below. They're fairly inexpensive. So if you're going to be doing pattern testing regularly, I highly recommend just buying your own scale. I do know of some of my pattern testers that I love this. I will love the day that I go to the grocery store and find someone weighing their yarn on the scales in the produce section. I think that's fantastic. So if you aren't ready to buy a scale yet and you want to weigh your yarn, go to the produce aisle. Sometimes they have scales that work there. What isn't going to work is probably your bathroom scale. You're going to be talking ounces and grams here, not pounds of yarn. I mean, unless maybe you're doing a blanket. So you're going to need a scale that has more accurate measurements than your bathroom scale. Tips for weighing. If you are doing a project that is all in just one color, you can wait to take your measurements until the very end. And then you can just weigh your final project, and you're going to compare your measurements, your weight of your final project to the weights listed on the yarn label to help you figure out how much yarn you've used. So you can either compare grams or ounces. So you're going to weigh your project, and you're going to take the number of, I'm going to say grams because that's what I usually do, but you can use either. Take the number of grams you have, and then next to it, you're going to list the information that is on the yarn label. So grams above yards listed on the yarn label. And then you're going to cross multiply. Getting real mathy on you here. You're going to cross multiply your grams that you got by the yards listed on the yarn label, and then divide them by the grams listed on the yarn label. And that will give you the yards that you used. If you want to use meters, change out meters. For yards, change out ounces. For grams, all those things work. And all of that information should be on your yarn label. So don't toss it until you're completely done. And if you did, look up the yarn online. That stuff's all listed online too. So don't panic if you tossed your yarn label. Just look it up and use that to find the weight ratios so that you can figure out how much yarn you used. Now, if you are doing something that has color work, this gets a little more complicated, and here's why. You cannot tell me how much of each of the 5 colors you used if you just weigh your final project, unless those colors are used in exact equal amount. So if you are working a project that has multiple colors and the designer wants to know how many yards you used of each color, what you need to do before you start is weigh each color separately, and then take notes on what was the weight and the yardage of the balls of yarn without the yarn label, because that's going to throw you off. Take the yarn label off, weigh each ball of yarn separately before you start. Do not rely on there just being the right amount of yarn in your ball. Almost every ball of yarn I have ever weighed, whether from a hand dyer, a small yarn company, a big, massive yarn producer, somewhere I shopped online, a local craft store here, almost all of them have not been the exact weight that's listed on the label. Almost all. So it is important not to just assume that the yarn you have there is exactly what's listed on the label, because if it's not, it's going to throw off all of your yardage at the end. And man, I have done it before where I have not weighed at the beginning, and then at the end I'm looking at my yardage going, I know that's not right. I know it's not possible. But now I don't know for sure what is correct. So take the time, weigh all of your colors beforehand. Then, instead of weighing your final project at the end, you're going to weigh your balls of yarn again and subtract what you ended up with from your starting number, and that's going to tell you how much you used. So let's say you started out with weighing your color A, let's say, and you had 100 grams spot on. That's very unusual, but I'm making easy math for myself. So you started out, you weighed color A, it had 100 grams. You weigh color A at the end of your project, and it has 80 grams. I'm going to take 100 grams minus 80 grams, which gives me 20 grams used. Okay? So I have 20 grams of that color in my project. That's what you're wanting to figure out. Then I'm going to do my cross multiplying thing again, where I'm taking my 20 grams, multiplying it by the yards listed on the yarn label, dividing it by the number of grams to get me the yards I used. All right. And then you need to do that with every single color. So if you use 2 colors, you got to do it with 2 colors. If you're using 5 colors, you got to do it with 5 colors. I will link to a blog post that has all of these formulas and information in it, and has a place for you to enter in your email address. And I'm going to send you a document that has a checklist of things that I recommend you do as a tester, and is going to have these formulas so that you can plug in your yardage for each new pattern test, and then you don't have to memorize these things, because who has room in their brain for all these things? So that is how you go ahead and figure out the weight of yarn that you have used. Another thing that a designer is probably going to want to know is sizing. And so be sure that you are checking for fit and size. And then you can go ahead, once you have gauge swatched, once you have weighed your yarns, you can go ahead and dive right into working the project. Friends, so important that you pay close attention to detail and that you read directions carefully. Sometimes the most questions I get in a test are things that have already been answered in the pattern notes. If you are in the habit of not reading pattern notes, shame on you. I'm kidding. But it is important to read them. We designers put that information in there because we think it's important and because it has implications on how you work the final project. So read those notes very carefully, and then read every line of the project carefully, and take notes on stitch counts. That's another thing that if you wait until the end, it can be a pain to take, especially a big project, to go back and count stitches and make sure that they're all right. I highly recommend, as you go along, take note of any minor things, small things that are missing. Ask the designer if like a stitch count is off. If you think it's off, that's a great thing to bring up to the designer and say, hey, I finished this row. You have 12 stitches listed for my size. I got 10 stitches. And then you and the designer can work together, or the designer can work to figure out, is that supposed to be 10 or 12? I do want to say it is not your responsibility to fix the pattern for the designer. If you come across a problem, it is simply okay to say, things aren't lining up here. And then it's the designer's job to go back and figure out why. you don't have to figure out why. So don't feel pressure that if you find a mistake and you can't figure out the solution to it, that's not your job. Finding the mistake is your job. So read each line very carefully, count your stitches very carefully to make sure that all of those line up, and take really detailed notes so that in the end, when you give feedback, you can give really detailed feedback to the designer, because that is the most helpful feedback. One of the questions I get a lot about pattern testing is, when is it okay to modify a pattern that I am testing? My instinct here is never. Okay? Designers have preferences though. If you are making something, if you're making a pattern test, let me give you an example. Okay. I am a short person. I am only 5'3", but I wear a size large. So often patterns are a little long for me. So one time I was working a pattern test, and it had a crochet cable pattern down the front of it in a panel. Super cute. The designer said, work the cable pattern and then work it 5 more times. Because I am so short, if I had worked it 5 more times, it would have been a dress on me. Now, someone who was taller, it would have fit perfectly. So I messaged the designer and I said, hey, the pattern says repeat 5 more times. Do you want me to do that? Or is it okay if I leave out a repeat or 2? The designer said it was fine, make the pattern to fit myself. And so I left out, I think, 2 repeats of it. And then it fit me perfectly. It is really important before making any modifications, though, that you contact the designer and ask that if it's okay. Because I absolutely could have seen the designer saying, no, I need to know how much yarn the full pattern takes. And if you leave out 2 entire body pattern repeats of a large sized sweater, that's, I was going to say hundreds. It might be 100 yards of yarn that isn't getting accounted for in my final weight of how much yarn I used. Some designers are super like, do whatever you want, make it your own. But in my opinion, pattern testing, one of the biggest parts of pattern testing is making sure that the pattern works as it is written. So before you make any sort of modifications or additions or embellishments to the pattern, ask the designer. You can always make changes after the pattern test is done. So let's go back to the example of the sweater pattern. Let's say I had reached out to the designer. I had said, I'm very short. If I make the full repeats, it's going to be longer than I would prefer. And she said, no, I want you to work the full repeats. When I was done with the pattern test and had sent in all my notes and all my pictures and all the things, if I had looked at that really long sweater and said, I'm not going to wear that, I could very easily frog it back to the length I desired and finish the pattern up again. If I'm making a beautiful plain hat and I think, gosh, you know what would look really good on this hat? Like a big embroidered flower. Ask the designer if you want. But also, you can just make the hat, turn in your notes, take all your pictures, do all the things, and then add your embellishment and make it your own. During the pattern test, it is super important to stick to the pattern and to communicate really well with the designer about any even small modifications you think you'd like to make, so that they're getting the information that is most important to them and so that they're getting final pictures of their true pattern as well. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about pattern testing. I hope you found all of this information really helpful. As I said throughout the video, lots of links in the description below, so be sure to check those out for lots of other resources to help you out, including the blog post about completing a pattern test, because that's where you're going to go to enter in your email to get the free printable with your checklist and your formulas for figuring out yardage, so that you can use that to whiz through every pattern test and have lots of great notes to share with the designer. Next video, we are going to talk about giving feedback and promoting the pattern. So be sure to check that out when that comes available. As always, it's my goal to help you grow confidently in your craft. I hope I'm doing that with these pattern testing videos. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on anything I share here with you. I would love it if you would like this video. If you have questions, drop a comment below. I love to chit chat with you, or sign up for my email list and shoot me an email. I'd love to chat more in depth through email as well. Share this video with a friend who pattern tests or is maybe interested in pattern testing. That would be a great favor to me. And thank you again for joining me. Happy crafting.